Right, let's stay with the blackouts that continue to roll across South Africa. Stage 6 load shedding announced on Sunday, the highest level seen since 2019. It has been downgraded to stage 5, but the gaps in supply and the vulnerability of our electricity grid remains alarming. The general gap that led to the emergency energy plan announced by the president way back in July is roughly between 4,000 and 6,000 megawatts. But let's look at the figures. On Sunday, about half of Eskom's capacity was offline. 15,600 megawatts lost due to breakdowns and around 7,000 offline for planned maintenance, according to Eskom. Joining us now is senior researcher at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study, Dr. Sean Muller. Dr. Muller, thank you for being with us. Firstly, how bad do you think the situation is? Are we, as the DA leader says, teetering on the brink of a complete blackout?
Thanks for having me, Francis. Well, I think all South Africans know that South Africa is in a very bad situation right now. And, well, perhaps not teetering on the edge of a blackout, but certainly if enough capacity goes down, and it goes down rapidly and unexpectedly, then that's not entirely out of the equation. And some preparation has been done for that kind of situation. But I think, and it's entirely understandable that people are angry. It's inevitable that the opposition will try and make political capital out of this. But I think we also need to reorient the discussions that are being had, because clearly the narratives that are in play in the policy space haven't served South Africa very well over the last 4 years.
Well, let's try and get to the bottom of some of the issues. Firstly, I mean, Eskom has spoken about possible sabotage. People talk about unhappiness within the organization. Let's start there. When we see generation units going down en masse, is there possibly sabotage, or is this just an ailing system and these things happen?
Well, I think there's certainly the possibility of sabotage. I want to throw a proverbial spanner in the works, though, and say that if we're going to talk about sabotage, then we need to ask ourselves who's going to benefit. The general narrative in the media is that those who are most likely to be responsible for the sabotage are people associated with, say, the former state capture faction in the ANC, and perhaps individuals in Eskom working with criminal syndicates. That's certainly possible. But, you know, in the broader policy space, actually, the individuals and the organizations who are most likely to benefit are actually in the renewable energy industry and in the parts of the private sector that are desperately trying to push for very rapid decentralization of energy generation. Now, I don't think that they're responsible, and I don't think we have any definitive evidence of sabotage at this stage. But I think, you know, if one wants to talk about sabotage, then one has to ask who's actually going to be benefiting from the situation. And there are commentators who've written in the business press and actually literally said things like, maybe what South Africa needs is a full blackout. That way the president will adopt the right policies when it comes to renewable energy and so forth. And those are very disconcerting statements to be made. But the bigger question is about accountability. Because if Eskom can always blame sabotage, even if it's unproven, it can always blame disgruntled individuals, then how on earth are we going to have improvement? How do you hold the management of Eskom or the board of Eskom accountable when they're always allowed to roll out these excuses and often without any definitive evidence?
Yeah. Well, it is very hard. Who do we hold to account? How do we hold them to account? Because Eskom has made it clear that it is government that commissions new energy, and the problem is not enough watts on the grid. And it said it has huge issues trying to do maintenance. It can't even get the right tools because of the laws around procurement of any supplier. And that was the red tape that the president spoke about in July. So is Eskom in the position to fix things right now? That is my question.
Yeah, I must be honest, Francis, I find those excuses extremely annoying. All state-owned enterprises have had to operate by these rules in the post-1996 era, or in the era of the Public Finance Management Act. These are not new rules for Eskom. Expert commentators and senior government officials have been raising concerns since that act was passed and various regulations and other things were put in place, that it does create red tape. It does make it harder to run state-owned enterprise, much harder to run state-owned enterprises than to run private sector enterprises, but nobody really paid any attention. these are still hindrances on organizations like Transnet. So Eskom is not alone. It's not like it's facing these problems on its own. Is there a case to be made to loosen some of these impediments in general, and especially in the context of crises like these? Certainly. But when, for example, Andre de Ruyter came in as CEO, he knew what space he was operating in. The Eskom board know what space they're operating in. So the problem is this, and it actually applies to, essentially, you want to talk about President Ramaphosa's presidency. It applies to his presidency overall. South Africa was on a downward trajectory. Eskom, I would say, was on a downward trajectory prior to President Ramaphosa taking his position, prior to the Eskom board coming in, the current one, prior to the Andre de Ruyter coming in, and so forth. So no doubt about it, there was a downward trajectory, and in that context, things will get worse before they get better. But nevertheless, there needs to be some kind of tangible sense on what we can hold these individuals accountable for. They can't be allowed to keep making excuses. And when it comes to bringing new capacity online, for example, I mean, there's a bigger discussion to be had about the role of Minister Mantashe, who, yes, some criticism of him is valid, but actually some of that criticism is very disingenuous, because Minister Mantashe has been raising concerns about vested interests operating in the expert space, operating in the space of procuring local gas supplies and so forth. And those are actually very valid concerns. So there are people who want to get him out of the way for the wrong reasons. He is not directly responsible for Eskom. Okay, so the argument for getting him out of the way is because he's been supposedly blocking new capacity coming online. First of all, the proposals to bring that new capacity online, the costs of those for Eskom's finances and for national finances haven't been placed on the table. Okay, which is just a blatant violation of good policy practice. But the second thing is, if we put aside that issue of capacity for the moment, what are Eskom's objectives? What are their KPAs when it comes to maintenance, and why are they not realizing that? Because this isn't, for example, that South African power consumption is massively increasing, right? What's happening is that Eskom's reliability factor is going down. The capacity that's there is less and less reliable. So what are the targets that, what have they put on the table in terms of the maintenance plan? What are the objectives they should be achieving? My sense is they're not doing a good enough job. There are various reasons, statements and excuses as to why, around human resources and all these kinds of things. But that's not really good enough, because this is really the most important, most crucial issue in South Africa right now. These individuals are being paid huge amounts of money, and they need to be accountable to a clear and stated set of objectives.
If Eskom is full of excuses, what about the excuse that it needs the skills on board right now? Then reports come out yesterday saying that from a list of 300 turnaround agents or these people required, only 18 people had been recruited because of the political pushback. NUMSA is saying you can't just come in and take a proposal from Solidarity and you've got a list of white people. Is it time to sort of override some of our overarching policies or goals as a country to get this done? Or is that valid? Is NUMSA's argument valid?
Well, first, I think it's very hard to say without knowing who the particular individuals are, what roles they're supposed to be playing, who's there now, what happened to the previous people that were there, and so forth. I'm also not an engineer. I don't know a lot about the operational side, and I wouldn't want to pretend that I do. But in the broader policy context, I think, obviously in the context of crises, it makes sense to maybe consider loosening certain kinds of policies. But I am concerned about what looks like a sort of fetishization of the apartheid era of the South African state. And some of that is based actually on quite misleading, people talk, for example, about how low the electricity price was during apartheid. Well, that actually contributed to the inability to invest in infrastructure later on, right? So there's a lot of rhetoric. There's a lot of political maneuvering. There's a lot of maneuvering by vested interests, and that clouds these kinds of issues. It makes it very hard, unless you have the very detailed institutional information, to actually come down on either side. Perhaps the likes of Solidarity could be right, and there are experts who could help Eskom out that are being excluded, perhaps for reasons related to affirmative action. But NUMSA and others could also be right, that in fact this is just a misplaced valorization of former white employees of Eskom, who don't necessarily have such a big contribution to make. So, one would have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. It would be nice to be able to get away from the kind of politicking and the disingenuous rhetoric, but unfortunately, that's par for the course.
Yeah.
And you as the media obviously will do the best you can, hopefully, to cut through that.
Yeah, and it is hard. Like you say, we're pretty much in the dark unless you understand the inner workings of Eskom. And of course, now we have to talk about renewable energy. Bid window 5 may be reopened, but that's for a later discussion. Thank you for your perspective. For now, that was Dr. Sean Muller from Johannesburg, the Institute for Advanced Study, a senior researcher there.